All right. I want to welcome everyone for joining us virtually to the February version of our Forward in Energy Forum. We appreciate you joining us virtually in the Madison area and everywhere around the world. For those in the Madison area, hope you're all staying safe. For those of you, it's your first time. This is my daughter, Nora, who's home with me today as school is off. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us, Nora. So my name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And if you're not familiar with the Wisconsin Energy Institute, our mission is to provide leadership on campus, on the UW-Madison campus, for multidisciplinary research, education, and outreach efforts that accelerate the world's transition to clean energy systems and solutions. The purpose of our Forward in Energy Forum is to cultivate public understanding of energy issues. We do this on a monthly basis throughout the fall and the spring semesters. And our mission is to bring together experts both on and off campus to discuss the many dimensions of our global transition to cleaner energy systems. And so with today's discussion and many others, we try to encourage cross-disciplinary dialogue to explore the important technical, social, political, and economic dimensions of a wide variety of clean technology innovations and issues. And in relation to today's forum, cryptocurrency has gathered a lot of media attention lately, even a few Super Bowl commercials that you've seen. But what is less well understood is the total energy and climate impacts and other sort of negative externalities of this digital asset. You might have seen headlines such as Bitcoin uses more electricity than certain countries. However, the method by which various cryptocurrencies are mined, as well as where those mining operations are located, can make a big difference in the resulting energy and climate impacts. So today's panel will help us get a better understanding of these energy and climate impacts, as well as the promises and concerns of cryptocurrency and other blockchain technologies. A few announcements before we begin today's forum. I want to highlight next month's forum, which will take place on March 28th. It'll be a Monday. And to celebrate Women's History Month, we're launching a new podcast series at the Wisconsin Energy Institute, all about women in energy sciences. So for this forum next month, our student interns, Michelle Chung and Mary Riker, will preview a new series and speak with our panel of scientists about their experiences and advice for women in STEM. Second, I'd like to acknowledge that the land that the Wisconsin Energy Institute occupies, as well as all of UW-Madison, is the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk people, who have called this land Dejop since time immemorial. The Ho-Chunk Nation and 11 other First Nations residing in the boundaries of present-day Wisconsin remain vibrant and strong. We recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the 12 First Nations that reside in the boundaries of the state of Wisconsin, and also want to acknowledge that tribal nations are doing some of the most important and leading work in transitioning toward clean and just energy systems. Finally, a few logistical notes. You may see that we have live captioning turned on. You can toggle this feature using the live transcript button. And we ask you to submit your questions in the Q&A box. We have the option to upvote, so you can see other people's questions, and you can upvote if you would like to see that particular question answered by a panelist. You can also, as many of you are doing, introduce yourselves in the chat and where you're tuning in from. So thanks for doing that as well. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to our moderator for today, who is Kieran Furlong. Kieran is a senior fellow with COWS at UW-Madison and a venture partner with Rabo Ventures. He has extensive experience in the fields of renewable energy, chemicals, agriculture, innovation, and venture capital. Welcome, Kieran.
Great, thanks very much, Scott, and welcome everyone, especially a huge welcome to our panelists who we're going coast to coast here from New York to Los Angeles. So this is a really fascinating subject for me, one that I didn't know a whole lot about and still don't, but I'm probably in the same boat as many of our audience here as well. We've all heard some mutterings recently about energy consumption and crypto. But what can we make of it? You know, how can we put all those facts and figures together? What voices are being heard and what voices are not being heard in that? So that's why the Wisconsin Energy Institute has assembled this great panel of speakers, so we can all become a little more educated on the topic. And then that might be a good starting point, but it's also, there's a broader conversation to be had here around the interplay of energy and computing, and also, where these technologies are taking us, and are we trending net positive, net negative? What good are we doing for society with them? So we've got 4 panelists today who I'll briefly introduce. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves in more detail. So we'll go through each of the 4 panelists then with a short 5-minute or so overview from themselves. And then we're going to get into the discussion. And I really do want this to be a discussion. So for all of you audience members out there, there's a Q&A function. Start piling your questions in there. Better to have them in the Q&A than the chat, I think, to be able to, for the moderators here and hosts to follow. But the less talking I have to do, the better, I think, when it gets into the discussion. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Kyle McDonald. And Kyle, if you want to turn on your camera so we can all see you there. So Kyle is an artist working with code and exploring the possibilities of new technologies and provoking some thought into their consequences as well. He has shown his work around the world, and notably for this discussion has recently published a study on the emissions associated with Ethereum, currently the 2nd largest cryptocurrency by value. Next, we have Yvonne Taylor joining us. So Yvonne's a teacher, speech language therapist, and a community activist with Seneca Lake Guardian in the beautiful Finger Lakes region in New York. And she has campaigned on numerous energy-related issues affecting her community and is in the vanguard of bringing environmental issues with cryptocurrency to the public's attention. Next, I'd like to introduce Tad Piper from Compute North. So Tad is the Chief Financial Officer with Compute North. He, having worked as a trader and banker earlier in his career, he spent over a decade with early stage companies in software and technology. He's now with Compute North, a digital infrastructure company providing computing and blockchain services, about which I'm sure we'll hear more. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Destiny Knock. Dr. Knock is a professor in civil and environmental engineering and also the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. She's also the director of data analytics with Devio, and which is a mission-driven blockchain company pursuing environmental and social goods. Dr. Knock also researches issues of equity in energy and explores the trade-offs we make as we transition to more sustainable energy future. So those are my 4 panelists. I think to keep it easy for us all, we'll go in the same order for each of your 5-minute opening remarks. So Kyle, if you would like to take the lead, looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Great, thanks for having us. My name is Kyle McDonald. My pronouns are he or they. I'm an artist based in Los Angeles, and I came to the arts through music and code originally. I spent a lot of time working with new technologies like machine learning and computer vision. And for the last year, I've been researching the ecological impact of the Ethereum blockchain. I was already studying the massive energy use behind machine learning algorithms. So when I heard that similar hardware was being used for running the Ethereum network, I wanted to understand how it compared. I got interested because in early 2021, this discussion kind of blew up on Twitter as we started to see in the digital arts a reproduction for the first time of the contemporary art market, something that had never been done before, really. And around that time, another artist named Memo Acton created an NFT carbon footprint calculator. But instead of kind of guiding discussion, the tool was mostly used to shame other artists for their involvement. So a quick introduction, if you haven't been following this topic already, I want to explain what's going on with Ethereum. It's a cryptocurrency, just like Bitcoin. Bitcoin launched in 2009, Ethereum launched in 2015. Both of them use a system called proof of work to keep the network in sync across lots of distributed computers. Proof of work means that lists of new transactions are added to the database, which is also called a blockchain, only when a computer guesses a large random number. And the first computer in the network to guess that large number correctly gets a monetary reward, which incentivizes people to run these computers. And this process is called mining. Mining is sometimes described as solving a complex mathematical puzzle, but that makes it sound more honorable than it actually is. It's really just about guessing random numbers as fast as possible. So think about the mining process as converting electricity into currency. And at this very moment, there's probably around 10 million GPUs, 10 million computers all over the world running at full speed, converting electricity into ether as fast as possible. One important difference from Bitcoin is that Ethereum has the ability to run short scripts or computer programs called contracts. And these contracts allow people to create abstractions and rules for how the currency works. And they allow artists to sell certificates of ownership. So that's where the non-fungible tokens or NFTs come from. When a few artists started making huge sales in 2021, they were relying on this really energy hungry system. And some of the same artists who had previously been concerned about the ecological cost of flying from festival to festival in hopes of building an art career, now they were concerned about participating in this new system, potentially polluting system. But the exact kind of scale of that damage was contentious. So I tried to quantify the harm a little bit more, and I wrote about what I learned. I was hoping to show that, even though this feels impenetrable sometimes, with enough kind of care, we can quantify and disentangle it, even for me as an amateur in this field. And what I learned is that there's two really different problems involved. There's the technical question of total energy use and emissions, and then there's this ethical question of who is responsible. But I want to give a quick intro to the energy use and emissions. I had to characterize the Ethereum network as a whole. How many computers are there? Are they using older and slower hardware or newer and faster hardware? How efficient are their power supplies? Are they in data centers that use lots of electricity for cooling and lighting? By researching each of these questions, I was able to estimate the total energy use of the Ethereum network. And I found that right now, Ethereum uses around 3 gigawatts of power, or 26 terawatt hours per year. But no one really knows, is this a lot or a little? We know about like 60-watt light bulbs and 1,000-watt microwaves, but gigawatts and terawatt hours are kind of unfamiliar units, which means we have to make some unusual comparisons, like to countries. So Ecuador uses 26 terawatt hours per year as well, but this isn't really a great comparison because Ecuador is not a computer. It's a country of nearly 18 million people. Well, Ethereum has less than 1 million active wallets. We could say, okay, this is around 0.1% of global electricity use. And when we look at all of the proof of work cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, total is probably closer to 1% of global electricity use. We could also compare it to Facebook, which at about 7 terawatt hours a year, that's about a third of Ethereum, or Google, which runs a large portion of the internet via Google Cloud. They use 15 terawatt hours a year, still less than Ethereum, but every second Google's answering 50,000 searches and playing over 50,000 YouTube videos. And Ethereum only processes about 15 transactions per second. So after looking into this energy, I got deeper into the emissions side. And I learned that every region has a different mix of energy sources. There's geothermal in Iceland, hydro in South China, Kentucky and Xinjiang have more fossil fuels. And energy mix can be represented as this emissions factor number, which tells us for every kilowatt hour of electricity, how many grams of carbon dioxide are released into the atmosphere. So for renewables, this number is low. For coal, it can be as high as 1,000 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And I wanted to make sure this research could be kind of audited by everybody. So I sort of pulled up all these numbers kind of bit by bit for every region and year in an auditable way. And then multiplied this kind of whole network factor based on sort of locations of where the mining is happening by the energy usage to get around 20 kilotons of CO2 per day, which is annualized to around 7 megatons of CO2 per year. And so typical coal power plant produces around 3 megatons of CO2 per year. So Ethereum, something like 2 to 3 coal power plants. And that could be compared to maybe 4 million people in India or 500,000 people in the US, where our emissions are extraordinarily high. And this is also comparable to all the private jets that fly around the world, except there are more people using private jets than Ethereum. So that's the estimate. And then just quickly to wrap up, who's responsible here? This idea of like a personal carbon footprint, this was invented by an oil company. It was invented for an oil company, for BP, in the year 2005 by the advertising firm Ogilvy. And this concept was designed to deflect responsibility away from BP as a company and onto individuals. So I think when we look at these high emission systems, it of course, it's important to ask, what can we do personally? But I think we can't let that distract us from keeping pressure on the organizations that profit the most. And in the case of Ethereum, I think it's the marketplaces and the mining companies. I've been focused on the marketplaces. So art on Ethereum goes through OpenSea and Rarible and Foundation. They take up to a 15% cut. And only Rarible has considered moving away from proof of work a little bit. They've incorporated another blockchain called Tezos, which is not based on proof of work. The other organizations, other marketplaces have not. So this may all be irrelevant in a few months. Ethereum's scheduled to move away from proof of work completely around June. This transition has been 6 months away for nearly 6 years, but even if that transition happens, I think we have to ask ourselves, when tech move fast and break things, who picks up the pieces? Right now, the strategy is like when the industry just breaks something, they move on, and then the rest of us get left behind with the mess. We're left with the carbon in the atmosphere, a warming planet, rising seas, mountains of GPUs, and it's not really sustainable. So I think we need to reimagine how tech's built and how we hold it accountable. And I'm happy to be in part of this discussion where we can do that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Kyle. Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I'm a chemical engineer, and there's another industry got to start in the 19th century, but yeah, broke a lot of things, and there was lots of externalities at the start, or other people suffering before it was forced to clean up its act. So, and that's on a decades time scale, whereas in tech we seem to be on weeks. Yeah, very pertinent points. And also, I think the quote for the day might be, there are more people using private jets than Ethereum. There you go. How elitist can that be? Anyway, thank you very much for that. Moving on to Yvonne Taylor. You want to give your opening remarks, Yvonne? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Pleasure to be with you this evening. I am not an expert in this field. I am a speech and language therapist that works with troubled adolescents by trade, and an all-volunteer environmental activist for an organization called Seneca Lake Guardian in the heart of the Finger Lakes region of central New York. I live again in the Finger Lakes, where we're experiencing many real-life consequences of Bitcoin mining. After being banned in China, outside speculators are flocking to New York because power is relatively cheap here. About a decade ago, the bankrupt owner of a coal-fired power plant in Dresden, New York, sold its uncompetitive facility for scrap and surrendered its operating permits. For the next 7 years, that plant sat idle and on the western shore of Seneca Lake, and therefore produced zero emissions. But in 2014, Atlas Holdings bought the Greenwich power plant and converted it to burn natural gas rather than coal before starting it again in 2017. Over the next 2 years, the plant's focus gradually shifted from providing intermittent power to the grid and operating at only about 6% capacity to installing about 7,900 Bitcoin machines and running 24 hours a day. This increase in operations subsequently increased its air emissions tenfold. And today, Greenwich is primarily a private Bitcoin mining operation with over 17,000 machines and a goal of installing over 32,000 machines by year's end. These energy-hungry computers draw power from the plant's 106 megawatt generator for private profit. At full capacity, this single facility will emit over 1 million tons of CO2 equivalents into the atmosphere, which is the equivalent to that of about 100,000 homes. Greenwich Power Plant is also permitted to dump 134 million gallons of water into our Seneca Lake at up to 108 degrees Fahrenheit. This is extremely harmful to the fish and the health of the lake, potentially contributing to toxic algal blooms. 100,000 people depend on that water for their drinking water resource. The facility has yet to install screens that would prevent its intake pipe from impinging and entraining aquatic life, acting as a giant fish blender for millions of fish each year. Again, this is happening in the heart of the Finger Lakes wine country. where our driving economic engine is agriculture and tourism, and our livelihoods depend on clean air and water to support the 60,000 jobs and $3 billion annual revenue influx into New York State's economy. Greenwich threatens that clean air, water, our climate, our crops, and our jobs. Further, this industry's air pollution includes the same type of particulate matter that the EPA just found responsible for the preventable deaths of 143,000 elderly people. And Greenwich is not an outlier. Renowned environmental law firm Earth Justice projected that there are 30 upstate retired or retiring fossil fuel power plants and over a dozen others across New York in downstate that could follow Greenwich's example, gaining new life by repurposing as Bitcoin operations. So while Greenwich awaits a decision from the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, on whether to renew its Title V air permit, other facilities anxiously watch and wait to follow the Greenwich model. Greenwich is a New York test case for how these other plants will fall, and the crypto bros, as they call themselves, consider Greenwich their Alamo. In a wild west of New York, where we currently host 20% of all the Bitcoin mining in the US, and there are no regulations on the industry. We're connecting with communities across the United States who are also being negatively impacted by this industry, where facilities often sneak in under the radar as data or science centers. And depending on the facility, increase everyday person's electrical costs, siphon much needed renewable energy away from the grid for private use, make it harder and more costly for the public to access renewable energy resources, derail state and national climate goals, or emit harmful pollutants into the atmosphere which jeopardize residents' health. These facilities are not job creators, as the energy-hungry machines are fully automated, yet they jeopardize sustainable jobs that rely on a clean environment. Often these facilities are in environmental justice communities, as our friends in Adel, Georgia can attest to, or their greenhouse gas emissions have a disproportionately negative impact on communities of color. The energy amount used to generate cryptocurrency has been equated with that used by different nations, Sweden being one. Interestingly, Swedish leaders have asked the European Union to ban such crypto mining, saying that the social benefit of crypto assets is questionable. Crypto assets also have a significant negative impact on the climate, as mining leads to both large emissions of greenhouse gases and threatens the climate transition that needs to happen urgently. As mentioned, these same rationales spurred China to wisely ban crypto mining last year. So this is a statewide, national, and even international problem with grave implications. And again, this is, I want to point out, this is not to say that I am anti-technology or anti-crypto. And I believe that there are many beneficial uses for blockchain technology, but everything we do moving forward must be couched in the context of climate. And we can and we must promote models of cryptocurrency that are less energy intensive. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Yvonne. And I think you give a very unique perspective for your area, but it's also transferable to many other areas. Here in Wisconsin, we have at least 3 coal-fired power plants which are slated for closure. And one could imagine that new lease of life can be given to some of these assets. If there's economic alternatives to the cost of shutting things down. So I do think this is relevant for much broader scenario than just your specific one in the Great Lake or the Finger Lakes region. Great. Well, thank you very much. Next, I will call on Tad from Compute North to weigh in, and looking forward to hearing your opening remarks.
Yeah, appreciate it, Karen. Thanks for having me here today. You know, just by way of introduction overall, I'll start a little bit with where Compute North fits in all this. We're an infrastructure provider, what we call Tier 0 data center development. I'm going to go back just a little bit to how our company was formed and how our founders came together, because I think it's informative of the way that we think about both where we fit in the overall data center development crypto world, as well as where we fit in the power sector overall. Our two founders, one came from the data center world with 25 years of experience in the data center world, and identified that data centers were increasingly inefficient, and that they use a lot of power to cool things that were unnecessary. And so there was a lot of focus on how can you both reduce the cost of building data centers, but importantly, how can you make them run more efficiently by actually having computing infrastructure that was suited to an air-cooled environment. It is a fact that crypto is an early adopter within that sector, so I'll address that as well. But then secondarily, our other co-founder is 25 years developing, really with the last 20 spent developing renewable energy projects, mostly in the area of solar, and identified the fact that the increase in renewable energy was creating massive disruption and massive dislocation in the power grid overall. And as the two of these two founders came together, I was lucky enough to join them 2 years ago. But as they initially came together, it was to essentially bridge the gap between developing more efficient, shall I say, data centers overall that were cost effective and used less overhead power relative to the amount of computing, or what is oftentimes referred to as PUE, power use efficiency, if you will, and also partnering with the power grid to essentially provide an intermittent use of power, similar to the way a battery works. And today, that's very much where we sit, is at the intersection of intermittent power supply, meaning intermittent power demand, and providing more tools to stabilize the grid as we move forward. As I like to say, as long as everybody isn't willing to go camping and only have their cell phone charged when it happens to be sunny out, and they can charge it when they walk into their house and turn on the lights, they expect it to come on. There is a need with the increase in renewable power to likewise create more and more tools to manage and from day to day operate that grid successfully. Let me provide a couple of other statistics that I think will help frame our discussion overall. I've heard some of the statistics that Kyle introduced a number, as did Yvonne as well. In terms of coal power plants across the US, there are 80 coal power plants scheduled for decommissioning over the next 3 decades. Ideally, some of that will be accelerated overall, but that represents 98.3 gigawatts of power, which is, as it relates to, say, power use in the state of Texas, that's over, sort of two times your average day of total usage across the whole state. The overall Bitcoin network uses about 0.14% of global power today. I think Kyle mentioned 26 terawatt hours of energy is used by the Ethereum network. Approximately 220 terawatt hours of power is used by the Bitcoin network overall. We talked just a little bit also about the evolution of what's happening on the grid and where kind of we sit in our industry overall. There's two massive trends occurring in two different areas. One is in the area of power, and the other is in the area of computing. Both are moving from a centralized world to a decentralized world. So at the extreme in power, you're moving from large power plants with distribution from those central sources of power generation to distributed power. So at the extreme, think rooftop solar on people's houses, moving away from 1.2 gigawatt power plants, be them either coal traditionally or gas-fired power plants, moving towards distributed power. So that is creating a lot of disruptive effects on the grid overall. And then in the areas of computing, we're moving from centralized computing. What I mean by that is where the redundancy and power backups and things like that are at the data center layer. So, uptime is next to godliness in the data center world. Think 5 nines of reliability. it's all about uptime. It's about, streaming Netflix. And it's hard for me to say that with a straight face, that's an absolute necessity in terms of reliability, but it is a fact. Email servers, things like that, everything is about uptime. And so data centers today are built like fortresses. They're built with redundant power sources, UPS, interrupted power supply. They have a very high overhead to maintain that environment. However, what's happening with distributed computing is we're moving from the redundancy at the hardware layer, i.e. data centers, to the redundancy at the nodal layer, meaning at the network. So if part of the network goes down in location B, those workloads are picked up in a different location, with obviously blockchain and global blockchain being the best global example of that. No other computing function can have 50% of the network come offline in one and have it not miss a beat. And that moving from redundancy at the hardware layer to redundancy at the network layer is allowing for the computing and data centers to match the change in the power grid. And this is a symbiotic relationship that provides a level of pragmatism about how we move and actually increase the amount of renewable power on the grid, while also providing solutions that allow us to balance that. So as I said, we're not all camping, hoping it's sunny every day, or there's a steady wind every day to keep our lights on. So I'm looking forward to the conversation overall, looking forward to how we talk about this transition and how we're really in the midst of a very exciting transition in these two kind of colliding areas of power and computing.
Great, thanks very much, Tad. I think I've got my soundbite there. Uptime is next to godliness. But yeah, I think we're going to get into some of this, movement away from centralized and movement away from complete reliability at a given data center, and instead this nodal redundancy, I think you called it, which would be good. Very good. Okay, so the last but not least, I'd like to call on Dr. Destiny Knock to give her opening remarks. So Destiny, over to you, please.
Thank you so much for having me. So as a reminder, I am approaching this from an academic lens of what can we possibly do with blockchain technology that we might not be doing currently as we are managing our computing as well as processing so much data. And so my work has really been focused on energy system planning, energy system analysis. How do we increase the sustainability of our energy systems in a broad sense? And one of the things that a lot of people are discussing right now is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, right? So, we hear some earlier speakers discuss, the fact that some of these blockchain technologies are very, emissions intensive, but there is like another kind of side of this coin where we could actually use blockchain technologies to verify carbon emission reductions. And so as we are moving towards a net zero energy future, there's a lot of data coming in, and there's a huge risk that people will be double counting that data. And so I think oftentimes when people kind of hear about blockchain, they just immediately jump to the cryptocurrencies, they jump to like Bitcoin. But really, blockchain technology is a data ledger, and it can, include introduce some more verifiability as well as tracking of this data. Because one of the big risks with carbon emission reductions is who gets the carbon credit, who gets to claim that they have reduced the carbon. And as we are seeing with, for example, electric vehicle technologies more come online, it's like, does, the car manufacturers get that credit, the charging stations, the homeowners, the cities that incentivize the building of the charging stations. And if we are not accounting for all this data and verifying how it's moving through our system and who's getting credits, then we actually are at risk of double counting a lot of those credits. And then that would not be effective in our carbon emission reductions or even air pollution emission reductions. And so one of the things that I've been doing recently is I have, kind of started partnering and consulting for a startup company called Devio and Dev ESG, where they actually have created another blockchain type of technology, which uses a sharding method. And an independent consultant had recently come and actually found that they consume 3.5 billion times less energy than Bitcoin per transaction. of their data processing. So I think that, we've talked a little bit about, the current issues, but I think that there are always innovations to be made in the way that we process this computing power, as well as process our data. I feel like I normally end up taking a more optimistic approach than a lot of other academics, but, if you think, like 60 years ago, right, computing was like the size of a desk, right? One computer was the size of a desk. Now we have so much computing power in our cell phones and it just can handle so much more, right? Process so much more than, a huge computer could do back in the day. And so I think that one of the other, opportunities is to really fuel innovation in, data processing as well as blockchain technology management. And then in the kind of broader sense about like, how can we maybe use this to do social good? Again, it's like when we reduce our emissions from the blockchain technology, as well as then start using that blockchain technology to track and process data, there's a lot of other social good opportunities out there. For example, healthcare data, right? There's a lot of privacy concerns. There's a lot of worry about hacking of that data. And so then when you have this blockchain technology where it's storing the data processing at 7 different locations, for example, then it can actually see, okay, like this one place got intercepted. This is where we have our privacy leak, but now we can actually verify that, that part of the data is, what was tampered with. And now we have this other way of verifying it, similar to the carbon emission reductions. So those are some of like the kind of broad opportunities that I've been seeing, mostly through my work with Devio and DevESG in the carbon and social goods space, as well as other thoughts on how we might want to think about innovating to kind of reduce our CO2 emissions from these technologies, but also using them to track actual reductions of CO2 emissions as we're moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Destiny. I mean, that's a phenomenal statistic. 3.5 billion times less energy per transaction. Did I hear you correct? Oh, you're on mute.
I said, yes, I'll put it in the chat.
Excellent. No, that's great. But I think that might be actually a great place to leap into the conversation from, because you made the statement, there are always innovations to be made. And I think, and we just have to wonder, how can we direct those innovations to be adopted or incent those innovations to be discovered, developed, and adopted? I mean, I'll start with one example, because I think it'll come back into some of the stuff you talked about, Tad. So I didn't grow up in this country. I'm an immigrant. And one of the things that fascinates all immigrants who come to America is the size of the fridges, okay? You Americans may not realize this, but these humongous, fridges are quite astounding for folks who come from elsewhere. And I'm sure many of you have a family member or a household of friends where you go, and there's an even bigger fridge sitting in the garage, keeping the drinks cool, right? So yes, we've incented people maybe to move to a more efficient fridge, and that's in the kitchen, but the old energy hog is still chugging away quite contentedly, guzzling down electricity in the garage. And I'm using that as a kind of, very simplistic metaphor, but if we think about that in terms of power generation as well, like how do we avoid that, where we're, continuing to keep maybe forms of energy that we would like to disincent because of some of these negative externalities? We price those things in to move to maybe a more sustainable energy future. But how do we actually adopt these innovations? And maybe that's for you, Destiny, to answer. Tad, weigh in. It sounds like that might be some of the stuff that Compute North is offering your customers as well. But yeah, how do we actually get these innovations to be adopted? So Destiny, maybe if you want to start with that.
I think that one of the biggest challenges for adopting different innovations is, so building on your fridge example, is the capacity, right? So can it actually handle everything that I want to have and get me to where I want to be? So for example, like with the fridges, okay, yes, you're, reducing your energy consumption, but when a person retains their old fridge, it sounds to me like you just gave a wealthy family a better fridge, and they didn't actually care about reducing their energy consumption. They just wanted to, be able to store more food at less of the cost, right? Or they wanted to get the rebate, for example. Whereas, what really should be happening with energy efficient appliances is going to the customers that maybe didn't have a working fridge, or their fridge is like on the fritz, and then we kind of incentivize them to first adopt this new technology. And you probably won't get a redundancy because maybe their fridge was broke, right? And so I think,
or they didn't have one. Yeah.
Right. Or they didn't have one. And so when we are thinking about like some of these blockchain technologies, especially when we are trying to move forward, one place to go would be to not just incentivize people that currently use the technologies to switch, but all the people that are going to try to get onto the network to start processing their data using these technologies is like your easiest way to kind of intercept, right? And then now you have started to create a critical mass. And then I think that it will also like lead to more testing of it, more developing of it. But then, they'll be able to incentivize other people to get onto these, to get onto like a more efficient method of processing, especially when you need to process a lot more data coming through your system. And so, like, for example, we have been at Devio, we've been talking to a couple of car companies, right? And so then having a way that we can connect them with all their suppliers to track all the data is something that can create community, right? It can create streamlining the process, and then you've incentivized people to all get on it. It's kind of like how, there's all these different search engines, but a lot of times now you just Google it, right? And that's become a tagline term. And so then I think that it's because it was efficient. It can handle a lot of things. It gives you, an algorithm that is closer to what you actually wanted. And so I think a part of it is, getting the new customers on, but another part is actually the speed and the computing capabilities.
Great, thank you. And I do notice we got some questions coming in from the audience, and I'll try and pull those into the conversation here shortly as well. But Tad, any comments on that, or Kyle or Yvonne?
Yeah, I think going back to what, the core of your question, I think that the question is we have to come back to what is the goal? Is the goal using less power, or is the goal producing less carbon? And there's a very distinct difference between those. I appreciate that one might lead to the other, but I don't think it's as simple as that. And I think we need to be looking at what it takes to run a grid at a national or multi-state level. On a given day, say in the state of Texas, you might, on a standard day, use 45 gigawatts. And on a cold day or a very hot day, you might use north of 70 gigawatts. The grid has to be developed to deliver power to 70 gigawatts. Otherwise, we go back to my camping analogy, right? And so I think it's very important to create a system whereby there is enough incentive to be able to deliver power in those peak load moments, and create an ability to reduce the difference between, if you will, the standard day and the peak days, so that the grid can be economically moved towards more renewable sources. So taking the example that you talked about, your refrigerator may not be the best example, in part because you want it to be cold when you go out to get your cold beverage or your frozen pizza or whatever it is that you keep in your refrigerator. But your electric car that's parked in your garage overnight, when the wind is blowing 30 miles an hour at night, when everybody's asleep and turning their lights off, scheduling those types of power usage in the middle of the night is an ideal transition for the type that we need in the grid of the future, right? And it's essentially figuring out how to balance production and intermittent production and distributed production with intermittent and distributed load or usage. And so the grid of the future is actually trying to balance those two things out. And so that's why batteries come into effect, right? It's so that, you have power when you want it, not necessarily just when it happens to be available. And I think computing infrastructure, car charging, many other things are going to evolve to use power when it is available. And the harsh reality of renewables is that it does happen to be windier at night, and more wind production happens to happen in the middle of the night. And there are many times in Texas that has a very large power grid and a lot of wind power, where the cost of energy in the middle of the night is in fact negative because they don't have anywhere to put it. So they actually pay to evacuate the power. So I think it's very important that power is not completely looked at as a zero-sum game, but actually a great big game of, three-dimensional chess, figuring out how to balance the grid to allow us to more aggressively move towards a higher percentage of renewables. And that, uses a lot of creativity in when people run certain functions, use certain power at certain hours and things like that. So I think there's a lot of wood to chop as we go through this evolution, but I just wanted to kind of reframe that it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. It's about balancing intermittent supply with intermittent demand.
Right. No, look, Tad, absolutely. And I think I, for one, I'll speak for myself, but I'm sure there's many in the audience as well. The goal here is not necessarily to reduce overall energy consumption or use, right? I think we do all have a stake in reducing overall carbon emissions and carbon intensity. But on the energy front, there's large parts of the world where they still need more energy. And I absolutely don't want to be one of these wealthy citizens of the rich world who wants to pull the ladder up after me. I'm like, well, we're okay, forget the rest of you type thing. So there is absolutely a goal, though, in some of the developed economies to look at reducing energy intensity of our economy and our economic growth, while recognizing in some developing economies there's just an absolute need for more energy to get going as well. Now, I think on your point around this balancing with the balancing of the grid, balance is a great word for this here. But I think this, Kyle, maybe I'll call you in here because you had talked about, hey, at 24 cents a kilowatt hour, you'll still chug away, and you can run computers to mine for Bitcoin or something else. So this gets to the challenge of it. I came from the biofuels world as well, and there was always the argument of, hey, let's plant this energy crop on marginal land. And I'm just like, listen, do you know any farmers? If they can make money planting it on marginal land, they'll make even more planting it on good land, right? So saying ring fencing an asset and saying we're only going to use it at this time or for this purpose can be challenging. But Kyle, maybe you want to weigh in on this.
Sure. Yeah, I'll say something quick. I was thinking, Tad, while you're just sharing your thoughts about balancing, which I think are spot on. We got to figure out how to balance and make sure that we have a grid that works at peak loads and low demand as well. But it just, something feels a little bit off to me here. If we can have transactions that are a billionth the energy usage, like if we don't need high massive energy consumption to have the benefits of these blockchain technologies, and we also have electric cars that are like ready to be charged. If these are both kind of doing the same thing, why are we mining Bitcoins instead of charging our cars? They seem like they both fulfill a similar role in the energy grid in terms of being kind of these controllable load resources. But one of them kind of works for a lot more people right now, and maybe we can get other benefits out of it too in the future. I think there's a billion cars in the world right now, and only a few million of them are electric. There's a lot of space to grow there, and I'm not sure that I want to see proof of work grow at that same scale.
All right, thanks. Hey, I'm just the question here from Joseph Campbell in the Q&A, asking about turning things on and off. And I think this fits into the intermittency, Tad, that you've already mentioned on the decentralized power supply or renewables power supply. But can they be turned on and off, the Bitcoin mining? Or to use your analogy, I'm glad you demystified Bitcoin mining for us, Kyle, because it sounds like it's more a bunch of robots looking for a needle in a haystack, or many needles in many haystacks, than solving complex algorithms. But can you turn them on and off to match power surges, such as the one that Tad was alluding to at windy nights in Texas?
Well, you don't need to turn them off on the windy nights in Texas. When you need to turn them off, and was when it gets cold. And the answer is yes, absolutely. And I think at the root of what Compute North is doing is creating what are called tier 0 data centers, which are data centers are measured on tier 4 being the highest level of redundancy, all the way down to to tier 1 in the traditional space. Tier 0 essentially introduces the premise that rather than uptime being the goal, cost-effective operations and efficient use of energy use is in fact the goal. And so, and look, I'm the CFO of a company, so economics matter to me. If you don't buy power 1% of the year over the last 15 years, you save 15% by just avoiding buying power in that 1%, in those peak moments. The other side of that is that we can shut off in those moments to avoid buying power when it's more expensive. That in turn helps balance the grid. It creates the economic incentives to do so. But to answer your question straight up, the answer is absolutely you can shut it off. And that is exactly what we do. And which means that a large tier 0 data center like we develop largely performs the same function as a battery does on the grid. It uses power during times when the grid doesn't need it, and it shuts off or does what we call the negawatt, which is essentially the watt never produced. It reduces its usage, which pushes that power that had been being used to the rest of the grid.
All right, I see that both Yvonne and Kyle have your hands up, but maybe Yvonne,
Absolutely.
you want to weigh in first, and then Kyle will come to you.
Sure, thank you. This notion of being a grid stabilizer, stabilizing the grid, I think is this argument is rather disingenuous. Bitcoin miners aren't in business to be grid heroes. They're in business to make a profit. And so, just using Greenwich, the Greenwich facility in my area as an example, they were putting a significant amount of energy into the grid when the Bitcoin value was low. But as Bitcoin increased in value, however, their contribution to the grid became less and less. So it would be fiscally irresponsible for them or any other company that's trying to make a profit and please its shareholders to supply power to the grid when they would have to take a loss, right? So in fact, the Greenwich facility right now has an application in to start drawing power from the grid. Because number one, they may anticipate that the value of Bitcoin will increase, and so they want to be more profitable. And number two, they may be hedging their bets to potentially, regardless of what our state asks them to do, be able to keep running. Another thing that I just want to point out about using renewable energies for this industry, the US needs to transition away from fossil fuels, and we're far from achieving that. And so I disagree with the argument that mining provides value to the grid because it uses excess renewable energy. My understanding is that there are great advancements and exciting new technology for long-term energy storage that could help stabilize the grid for providing the much needed power, renewable energy to the public. We could use that excess renewable energy to upgrade the transmission lines so that they have the capacity to distribute that energy being generated, and also adding energy storage so that that excess is stored for when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. But renewables are not a stable solution for cryptocurrency mining. And Bitcoin miners that tap into the grid increases the demand and base load, and increases ultimately our dependency on fossil fuels. So I don't think any of these arguments hold much merit.
Well, let's, I think there's a lot in there to unpack, Yvonne. So I think, first of all, yeah, we should make sure all of our audience, which I think many of them are already probably aware, globally, our primary energy supply is still 80% fossil fuels, right? So that's something I think we should all be aware of and we can all agree on. In terms of energy storage and increased transmission, yeah, so I'm involved, for example, with fusion energy. And one of my first questions in getting involved was, well, will we even need it, right? Will we have a future where we've got a sufficiently large interconnected grid or grids where power is moved around from where it's being generated to where it's needed? And then we do have some long-term storage to kind of, smooth out the bumps, if you like, here and there. And I think that's a long way off, right? It's a long way off before we're going to have cost-effective energy storage to do this. In that future, though, you'd be in a situation where, you know, converting electricity essentially into a cryptocurrency would just be based on, well, hey, I got to pay the same market price as anyone else for electricity. You know, so I don't know if Kyle, you had your hand up next, if you wanted to respond to some of Yvonne's points there as well.
Yes, more to what Tap was mentioning, but kind of in the same vein as
Sure.
Yvonne. You know, yeah, miners are not here to save us to make the electric grid work, but they do act as a controllable load, and I just don't think it's the one that we want. And I think something else important that Tad didn't say is, you know, that the places where this happens at significant scale, like on the ERCOT grid in Texas, you know, the miners aren't just shutting down in advance of a big storm because they want to save everybody. That has happened at a very small scale, but what's happening is the ERCOT grid pays the miners to stop mining. So they are literally using their funding to make sure that the grid stays up by telling the miners to stop working. So it's not like some free thing that we just, you know, get out of this nice benefit from these miners trying to keep us happy.
Right. Tad, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think all those comments are fair. I would say that some of this is related to the incentives. I think what Kyle just touched on, and I think importantly what Yvonne was getting at, New York State does not offer particularly great incentives around shutting down. So you are correct in stating that, and Kyle touched on it. I think Texas has been more proactive in providing means to incentivize people to shut off their operations. And that could be cryptocurrency miners, could be data centers, could be anybody in any business providing an economic incentive to shut your operations off is an important market-based way to provide that grid balancing. In the state of New York, there are less areas around that, and that's because it's what's called a capacity market, which essentially looks to pay for operations to provide that balance and has been less proactive. And I think we're at the early stages of what's called demand response. And I think the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, has pushed forward with sort of more proactively pushing towards what's called FERC 2222, which is a regulation that promotes more use of demand response, i.e. loads shutting off in order to help balance the grid, or what is oftentimes referred to as the energy imbalance market, to create those incentives to balance the grid. So I think a lot of what Yvonne highlighted is absolutely accurate in the sense that there are people connecting to the grid and looking at ways to do that. I do think that there's an evolution occurring that needs to continue to occur to provide incentives to have people want to actually shut off operations to manage the grid. And part of that is creating the active demand response market in order to do so. Batteries do it, peaker plants do it, spinning reserves do it, et cetera. I think there's a number of different ways in which the market needs to evolve and is slowly evolving.
Great. And actually, so I think we should all recognize, yeah, the electrical power market is highly regulated. It's far from being a free market system, right? So that comes back to, Yvonne, the kind of social and political pressure groups like yours are able to put on our public representatives and public utility commissions and so on, I think is critical. Get those voices out there and get them heard. But maybe Destiny, this is where, oh, you've got your hand up. I was going to call on you anyway with your engineer and public policy hat on, because Kermit in the audience here has a question around incentives as well. So yeah, how do we start looking at technologies that can do these transactions 3.5 billion times faster and have that become the norm? But you may have had another comment where you wanted to weigh in here.
Okay, awesome. So for like the kind of demand shifting and demand response, I do think that when we move towards a high renewable future, we do need to think about like, what's our goal, right? Who do we actually want to be absorbing that intermittent renewables? And like, I will just kind of give an example from my research is like, we know that low income households are actually not using a lot of energy, like when they would probably want to. So for example, in Arizona, there are low-income households that wait about 8 degrees longer than high-income households to even just turn on their air conditioning unit. And that's mostly likely due to financial strain. So one thing that we actually could do is try to incentivize companies to use blockchain technologies to identify those households and actually send, the extra energy there as opposed to just getting them to turn off. I think that, if we just are saying, okay, people who are mining coins, like just like turn on and off, like we're missing a huge opportunity of like, there are people out there that actually want to use that energy. And so, or want to use that excess renewables. And so then we could actually like send energy there and use blockchain to identify like who needs it and when they need it and when's the best time to get it to them. Now for the incentives, I do think that this is where kind of out of market things like, carbon taxes, carbon caps, those things might actually play a role in incentivizing things because, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, people are doing this because it's profitable, right? And so one way to incentivize less kind of less usage like during like high emission times is if you had a separate blockchain company actually looking at when the emissions are the highest, then you can actually create a pricing mechanism for energy usage around, different carbon emission times, like for when different power plants are online. And then you can actually use that to feed into a tax or some other sort of mechanism that the electric companies could use. So there are, I think, like, carbon taxes, carbon caps. I mean, we are in a revolution of the energy system where people are trying to reach these net zero greenhouse gas emission systems. And so I think that a lot of the challenge is getting people to think beyond like cryptocurrency mining of what social good can we do with these technologies. And then potentially, so one of the things that Debbie had proposed was to create a coin around social good. Right. So you actually have like what is like a carbon like standard as opposed to like a gold standard, where you actually get these coins for reducing carbon emissions, for example, which is how they got me on board. So I was like, oh, wow, that actually sounds kind of cool. Like, can I get a couple? Like, how do I get these things? Right. And how do I like, feel good about where my, kind of cryptocurrency money is coming from? Right. And so I think like right now, people get, more coins for doing more of these transactions, right? Solving the algorithms and just kind of running them, just maintaining and operating the system. But really, it's like, I think we need to look at like, how do we use that system to incentivize the world that we want?
Right. And I think that's great, Destiny, getting into some of these. Yeah. How do we actually verify? How can we all agree that we're looking at the same thing, right? That's where the carbon credits are for and so on. And then that's a great way to be able to price in things like a carbon tax and make sure we all know what we're getting. And then the power from that old dirty coal plant is going to be a little more expensive for a Bitcoin miner to go and use. And they may come along to Tad and say, hey, Compute North, can you get us some wind powered mining instead? And away you go. Tad, you've got your hand up.
Well, I think I share Destiny's optimism in the fact that in a lot of ways, in the technology lies the solution, if you will, in that the use of blockchain has the ability to use blockchain to measure and validate each of these things. And I think, far reaching from areas of power, carbon usage, healthcare efficiency. I mean, the amount of money we spend on processing healthcare transactions manually. I cynically believe that the healthcare industry is partially designed to make it hard to pay claims. Having blockchain technology take cost out of that system, making it more efficient and having it be decentralized, in a lot of ways solves a lot of the issues that we have, i.e. validation on both sides, no single point of failure, issues around data integrity, data security. Blockchain offers a lot of promise around that. And I think that the more, look, the fact that Bitcoin and Ethereum and things like that are the first foray into that, in some ways, I think has accelerated that progression. But I think, over the next 5 to 10 years, I think there's a lot of excitement around how that blockchain technology, and again, I'm a finance guy, so I like databases that have multi-entries and things like that. I think that's exciting. But I think, to Destiny's point, I think that there are, the technology lies the solution to a lot of measurement around how we get there. And so it's kind of a good symbiotic relationship in that way.
Very good. Kyle, I see you have your hand up. If you've got a pressing point, fire away, but I also want to make sure I get to some of the audience questions here. There's a few more outstanding. You're on mute.
I think it's pressing. I'll keep it quick. I just want to respond more to what Destiny was saying there. And there are some organizations that have proposed that blockchains can actually be foundational elements of climate coordination. There's been some minor successes, like KlimaDAO bought about 16 million tons of carbon offsets, and they're driving up the price of carbon on the voluntary market, which might create some demand for new carbon removal projects. But I'm kind of skeptical of these market-based solutions. Like, I don't know if they can actually scale. I feel like every time that we try and make markets like more efficient, it just accelerates things instead of kind of changing the direction. And I think if you look for like where the actual change is happening, Indigenous activists have been, fighting against infrastructure that has brought us like 100 times the gains of what any of these existing market-based solutions have tried to do so far. You've also got organizations like Bitmo who are trying to put Paris agreements on the blockchain and allow countries to trade with each other, which I think is maybe a little bit more of a positive direction, but because it's sort of in service of the will of the people instead of just trying to use the market to solve it. But I'm still not sure that you actually need blockchains in these solutions. A lot of the time, it's more of a kind of bigger cultural problem, coordination problem.
Right. And in fact, that's a critical aspect. So another big use case for blockchain that I come across a lot in my day job is food provenance, traceability, and so on, which is great. There's got to be an incentive to do so, right? You can do that right now with a spreadsheet if you're really motivated, but most people aren't, right? Or aren't willing to pay for it. So I think there will be applications for blockchain. And I think I saw someone in there David Huerta in the chat as well, talking about, what we can already do. We don't necessarily need blockchain. It's not the answer to everything. And I think that should be clear. In terms of some of the other questions in here, Raj had some on carbon capture and storage and sequestration as a way, obviously that's one way of tackling some of the carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning power generation. And then there's going to be increased electrification. Raj had asked around, electrifying HVAC equipments and so on, industrial use, process heat, for example. There's focus on electrifying that as well. But how will they impact here? I think maybe the one I wanted to touch on was Joseph Campbell had kind of flagged that the proof of work is one of the challenges. And I think somebody in the chat had also said, it's not so much, blockchain that's the problem, it's how we're doing this. And I do say that's something, a currency, it's a social contract. It's an agreement. We all say that thing has value, right? That cowrie shell, that piece of green paper, that has value. Why did we pick one that's going to take up so much energy? Couldn't we have gone after something else? So maybe we want to talk about some of the other potential options for ensuring the validity of a cryptocurrency. So somebody want to take that proof at stake or other ones that are out there? No volunteers. All right.
I just have one thing to say. I mean, I'm not an expert on the multiple different kinds of crypto that there are out there, but I do know, as Destiny has said, there are other models of blockchain technology that use far less energy than proof of work. And so if we think that, we have to keep mining Bitcoin or, using proof of work as a model for blockchain technology, we're wrong, right? And so, that's my position, is that we just need, we can be a leader in blockchain technology, and we can be a leader on climate, provided that we use the proper model of this technology.
Excellent. Yeah, indeed. And I'm just looking through the questions. We had one from the eponymous anonymous, but saying as a wealthy nation, we should reduce our energy consumption, but how will this industry reduce its consumption? I think that brings us back into our incentive conversation and how we actually ensure that the incentives are pointing things in the right direction. MS Finn was asking about it is 3.5 billion times less energy, if I got that correct. Okay, yeah, I mean, look, there's one thing on this currency. I mean, again, we're assigning something of value, something that we can all kind of look at. My wife gets annoyed at me every time I give my engineer's definition of jewelry. You know, I don't think there's really anything special about gold or diamonds. Gold is for catalysts and diamonds are for drill bits. Like, it's just something that we all agree as a group of humans that that's something we're going to assign value to, right? And I don't see there's any difference in a bar of gold, a shiny diamond, or, you know, something in the digital ether that we've decided has value. But can we do it in a way that is equitable, is sustainable, and fair in some way, right? So maybe I think we're coming close to the end here. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but panelists, while someone else is speaking, if you want to weigh in on any of those, please do. But maybe we just finish up here with a quick wrap-up comment from everyone, even if it's just to say, hey, thanks, it's been fun. So who's going to go first?
I can say it's been fun. I will weigh in on that, Karen. I think it's been a great conversation. I appreciate you all putting this together. I think there are lots of questions and will continue to be the difference between, shall we say, the infrastructure and providing the infrastructure and what is necessary to run the infrastructure of blockchain and what blockchain itself is. Blockchain technology in and of itself is as simple as a double entry database where people both agree and validate in a common space. The way in which that is protected, if you will, I've heard the energy usage described as a feature. I don't know if that's, and a security feature. I think that this has been a really helpful conversation. I think there's a lot of evolution to be had across the. I think somebody highlighted something to me. When people first talked about things like Airbnb and things like that, everybody said what or Uber or things like that. Why would I want to ride in somebody else's car or spend time in somebody else's house, right? Initially, all of these technologies are scoffed as a change. I'm just a firm believer, as somebody who's been involved in a number of different advents and changes, that it's a very exciting time in both the energy and the computing sector. And I'm just excited for what comes next. I think more conversations like this will help guide that, looking at the pros and cons of every technology and making sure we keep that discussion front and center, because I think it helps keeps us all honest as it relates to the evolution of these technologies. So thanks for having me here, and it's been fun.
Appreciate you coming in with the industry side perspective, Tad. Yeah. Next person. I'm going to make sure you all say something before we wrap it up here.
I also want to say thanks. I really appreciate it. And thanks for including me on this, especially as another non-expert. It's nice to be, to feel like the thing I've been thinking about for the last year has some value to it. But I guess I want to finish with an exhortation to kind of, maybe we can find a way to work together a little bit better on the transparency would be really good, especially for miners, but also around kind of the energy data. I mean, a lot of the work that I did while I was researching this around the emissions was just like digging into, government file after government file, trying to find information about what the actual power grid, energy mix is like in different places. And then you have these organizations like the IEA, the International Energy Agency, that are like hoarding that data, even though they're taxpayer funded, and it just doesn't make any sense. So I guess what I've realized over the last year is just like, there's a lot of space here to coordinate in a more kind of crowdsourced and open way. And then again, so for miners, that joining in that transparency would be great, but actually even more important is like some accountability on the miners' behalf. I don't know that transparency will actually get us that far if they're not actually accountable to their local community.
Very good. Local community, I think this is a good place for you to weigh in, Yvonne.
Sure. Thanks, everybody, for the opportunity to participate in this extremely important discussion. I think as an activist with boots on the ground in an impacted community, the one thing I want to point out is that, these crypto miners, I know the blockchain technology is innovative and interesting, but cryptocurrency miners are moving by the droves into the US as other countries are banning it. And we must do something, because if our future means that going out to buy our morning cup of coffee is the equivalent of smashing your iPhone and using up as much energy as it would take to power your household for 60 days, we need another plan, and we have a problem. So I hope everyone can agree that that is, we need a solution, and we need to act quickly. And one of those ways that we can do it is all of us need to advocate for some regulation of this industry in this country. So with that, I'll just say thank you so much for the opportunity, and hope to carry on a conversation.
Great. Actually, and talking about smashing up your smartphone, I think this is really interesting, right? Because I thought we were headed to this new glorious lighter footprint on the Earth future, right? Where back in the 1960s, when you wanted to be a cool cat, you went out and bought a huge hunk of steel called a Fort T-Bird. You consumed lots of metal and stuff, and it was all very heavy to move around. And now you just take a cool photo on your Instagram, and shouldn't that be a much lighter footprint? Interesting factoid I came across recently in a book by Vaclav Smil, who I'm sure many of the audience members are aware of, a preeminent author in the whole area of energy and global history, was pointing out that the embodied energy in a modern smartphone on an annual basis, because we only have an expected life of these for about 2 years, is actually more than your car when it comes to embodied energy. So I think we just need to be really thoughtful. And that's part of the purpose of this event here as well, is to get us all thinking about and informed about the consequences of some of the ways we're living our modern life. But Destiny, on to you for your final comment here too.
So building on how we are kind of leading to some consequences of our modern life, I think that one thing I will challenge the audience and just people in general to think about is that technologies themselves are not inherently good or bad. Like, for example, if you look at solar, there's a lot of, environmental benefits, but also there's a challenge that not everybody can adopt solar. And if you're a renter, for example, you live in an apartment complex. And so some people have used this to make the argument that solar is inequitable. Well, actually, technically, the technology itself isn't inequitable or equitable. It's the fact that underlying resource-based inequities lead it to not be able to be adopted by multiple people if they're constrained. And I think that that's kind of something where we also need to think about, blockchain technology and these mining type of platforms and data processing type of platforms, is how can we intentionally design them to promote the future that we want, right? And so technology by themselves will not get us there, but it's really like how socially we use those technologies, how we design those technologies, and how we integrate those technologies into our lives. And I feel like when people are like, oh, well, the market will handle it. And not saying that my fellow panelists have said this, but in general conversations where people say like the market will handle it, that's when I think people miss the fact that actually, no, it probably won't, that you have to be very intentional if you want to lead to a socially good or socially just outcome.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely fair. And I think, reminder that technology is a tool and it's how we use them. My favorite example is fixing nitrogen, right? So the Haber-Bosch process, chemical engineer here, but that was a tool initially made explosives for the Germans in World War I, was then converted to producing synthetic ammonia fertilizer to feed the world. And that's why most of us on this call exist, otherwise we wouldn't. And yet now it's one of the biggest culprits for carbon emissions as well. So, these are tools, they have consequences, and we should educate ourselves to be aware of those. Absolutely. I think your point as well on the markets solving everything, couldn't agree more with you, Destiny. Look, move fast and break things you'd referred to earlier, Kyle. We got to be careful what we're breaking. And if these things are at around 1%, I think was the statistic I heard earlier in terms of global electricity usage, that got to 1% very, very quickly. And that may sound like a small number. On a global scale, that is huge. So I do think there's an important role for what are the incentives, what are the regulations, what's the public policy? And I think that's where there's a role for Yvonne and groups like yours, Yvonne, and everyone else on this call to be part of that conversation as well. I think the equity, there was a few more questions. There's one from Kermit here, Destiny, as well. That Kermit, I know you. Maybe we can follow up. We won't have time to get through all the questions, but I think this is probably a good point to just wrap it up. Really appreciate the panelists coming on. Really appreciate the engagement from the audience as well. Who knows? Maybe we'll have this conversation again in another year or two and see where things have landed. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Audience members, apologies if we didn't get to all of your questions, but keep your eye out on future Forward in Energy forums here with WEI. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Kieran, for moderating. Thank you, all the panelists. It's been a great discussion. And yes, please join us next month for the March 28th forum. And also, we will be posting this video in a few days on our YouTube channel for those who want to share it with any friends or colleagues or family. So thanks, and hope to see you next month.